Okay, well, thanks very much. Thanks very much for giving up your Saturday afternoon. I can tell you that Carlton are beating Adelaide, which I hate and love. Now, one of the... I was thinking about how to do this because this is a really important part of MMT, and this is a real foundation part of MMT. And you read the Twitter sphere and other things out there, and I keep being told, drop the job guarantee. It's not essential for MMT. It's just alienating to people. And, well, I don't interchange much on social media because it's sort of pointless, but anyone who maintains that position fundamentally doesn't understand yet MMT, the work we've been building for, well, in this case, since 1978. And so I thought that if you're a group who want to be educated in MMT rather than empowered, and there's a sort of slight difference in those two concepts. So if I was doing a politics in the pub, I'm sort of empowering people. If I'm teaching students, I'm educating people. And I thought today, even though it's Saturday afternoon and there's football on, I would be an educator rather than an empowerer, because this is a really crucial topic. So this is a really dry discussion today, and it's academic rather than political. And so, you know, it's a really difficult literature. And so I've sort of, why I was thinking about it was how I convey a difficult literature in a short, relatively short period of time to a group of probably non-economists. That's a difficult task, I can tell you. So there'll be things that I may say that you won't have a clue about, and if that's the case, just tell me and I'll see if I can convert the jargon into words. If you've already got my textbook with Randy and Martin, then this is the chapters that are involved. And so that's what we'll do. And I'll try not to use too much jargon, but I'm an economist after all, and it's hard to get out of your skin. So it's essentially a talk about inflation and ways of dealing with inflation in a monetary system. That's what the topic today is about. And when we think about this across different schools of thought in economics, it's relatively uncontroversial that the goals of government are full employment and price stability. So even a mainstream economist will agree with that statement. And so then the question is, well, how do you get there in a monetary system? How do you achieve that? And one of the other things that economists all agree with is the concept of efficiency. And efficiency is doing the best with what you've got. That's a sort of prosaic way of expressing it. And we think about micro efficiencies and macro efficiencies. And so if you've been around for cognizant for the last 30 years, you'll know that there was from Paul Keating onwards in Australia, there was this constant discussion about microeconomic efficiency, deregulation, microeconomic efficiency, fixing up transfer systems, pensions, unemployment, income support systems, weeding out the inefficiency and the corruption. And so the whole emphasis on neoliberalism has been constructed within this concept of micro-efficiency, getting the trains to run on time and stuff like that, getting markets to work better. Yet at the same time, they've allowed unemployment and underemployment and labour underutilisation to persist at elevated levels. Now, when we think about macro efficiency, you can't be efficient getting the best out of what you've got if you've got unemployment and underemployment. You're wasting resources on a daily basis. And when you do the sums, the losses, the daily losses of income to the economy from macro inefficiencies dwarf by several multiples any of the estimated inefficiencies at the micro level. So things not running on time and all of that stuff is minuscule losses compared to the losses, the daily losses that an economy endures by having labour underutilisation. So one of the things is that neoliberalism has got its priorities all wrong in pursuing one form of efficiency and at the expense of the far greater problem. Now, when we think about price stability, there's really only two ways you can get it. And these both involve the use of what we call buffer stocks. And you can either have an unemployment buffer stock or you can have an employment buffer stock. That's really the only two ways you can discipline price fluctuations. And so the question for today is, what's the best buffer stock to use? And as a derivative at the end, I'll hopefully disabuse you of the notion that income guarantees are better than employment guarantees. Because a lot of progressives have been totally sucked into this idea that it's better to have basic incomes. I can't believe that people would think that, but we'll talk about that. All right, so I've already said that. The conventional buffer stock that's used to discipline prices in monetary systems under neoliberalism is an unemployment buffer stock. And it's what we call a NAIRU, and I'll tell you what that is in a moment. And the MMT approach is to have an employment buffer stock for reasons I'll explain. And I'll explain where this idea came from and entered into MMT. And it came from sitting in a building deep in the winter just on the other side of the campus there in Royal Parade while I was studying agricultural economics in 1978. Now this is sort of the things that you would need to know for me to fully get this topic across. You'd need to know about how employment's generated. You'd need to know about why unemployment occurs. You'd need to know about the use of the quantity theory of money in monetarism, about the expectations, augmented Phillips curves and blah, blah, blah. And what I'm going to try to do is cut through all of that and just distill a few of the key points just to give you a context. Because this would take me maybe 6 weeks in a course at university level. So it's a 60-year-old literature or more. So let's think about what economists call the Phillips curve. It's named after a New Zealand control engineer, Bill Phillips, W.A. Phillips. And initially when economists were thinking about what do we mean by full employment, what does that actually mean? Well, the way we thought about it before the 1950s was that it meant what it probably should mean, that there's a job for anyone who wants it. And in those days we weren't worried about fractional employment and casualisation, and so we didn't really think in hours, we thought in jobs and people. That everybody who wanted a job should be able to get it. And we understood quite clearly that at any point in time there'd be people moving between jobs. And so if you had a national statistical authority who was running surveys, well then at each point there'd be some people who would say, no, I haven't got a job because I'm moving between the jobs. And we called that frictional unemployment. So it was just the frictions of, job shifting isn't instantaneous. And so we allowed within our concept of full employment a small amount of unemployment, which was typically very short term. And, long-term unemployment, the statistical authorities used to call long-term unemployment any unemployment over 3 months. Now it's over 12 months, and there's pressure to make it over 2 years. Political pressure to make the definition over 2 years as we've shifted. So so full employment doesn't mean there's not unemployment. It just means it's a very small proportion of the labour force, which are all those people who want a job or who are working. Now, in 1958, a famous article was published in the literature, and this was by Phillips. And this is when the Phillips curve entered the mindset. And what the importance of the transition in concept was that we stopped talking about full employment in terms of just jobs, and we started to talk about it in terms of inflation stability, price stability, which was quite an important difference. We started to reconstruct the debate about full employment, not just in terms of getting enough jobs there, but in terms of the relationship between the activity in the labour market and price inflation. And essentially what Phillips did was he examined the relationship between economic activity proxied by the unemployment rate, with the idea that if the unemployment rate is low, then economic activity must be strong, and vice versa. And he studied the statistical relationship between movements in the unemployment rate and movements in wage inflation. Now, the proposition's pretty straightforward, that if you've got low unemployment, that suggests there's strong demand for workers, labour, and that puts the workers in a stronger position relative to if there's high unemployment, and it means they've got better capacity to bargain for higher wage growth. And so at low unemployment, you would expect there to be stronger wages growth, and because then firms will mark up their unit costs, which are the costs per unit of production, with some profit markup to arrive at their final price that they sell things at. Is everyone with me so far? Good. Then if wages are inflating, then if they want to protect their markup, they'll just push prices up. And so there's a direct link then to price inflation, CPI inflation, whatever you want to call it. And so this led to an idea that what we call demand pull inflation, that if there's a lot of aggregate spending going on in the economy, that firms will be producing a lot of stuff and hiring a lot of workers, and those workers then, the bargaining power within the labour market shifts towards the workers, and that will push up prices, and it's sort of demand pulling up the price level, pulling up creating the inflation by pulling up prices. That's the concept. So we've just done about a lecture in economics. And this then led to the very famous unemployment inflation trade-off. And for those who prefer pictures, here's a picture. So up here, we've got changes in wages, and you can then say that's really inflation because of the effect through profit margins. And this is the unemployment rate. So the concept, so he measured it, did a did an econometric exercise, a statistical fitting of the data, and more or less came up with a curve looking a bit like that. And there's all sorts of technicalities about why it's convex and all that, but that's not for us today. So the essential point was that we shifted from worrying about full employment, about being enough jobs, to the concept of a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. So in other words, governments started to think in terms that they had a trade-off between two evils. If they wanted lower unemployment, they'd have to accept higher inflation, and if they wanted lower inflation, they'd have to accept higher unemployment. So then, you know, young graduates would go into government departments and be doing all this stuff. And then the question was, how do you make that decision? So they invented this concept called a social preference function. So they tried, it's, you know, otherwise known as polling, surveying, trying to work out what we all care about. And so they'd get some social preference function which told them what people would be prepared to tolerate. And so this point here became the sort, you know, in technical terms, that's an optimum, where the rates of change are identical. And so this point here, if you could estimate those things, that was the point that the government would aim for, because they could get the preferred unemployment and inflation combination. So there was a whole army of young graduates would do all this stuff in the 60s. This was a real job opportunity for economics graduates in government departments. And so the point was then that there was a concept of a trade-off, and policy had to steer the economy to make sure that you got to a point which was considered, you know, politically acceptable, basically. That's what it is. And the governments knew that if they wanted to get even lower unemployment, they'd have to accept a bit of higher inflation. There was no question about how they would get lower unemployment. They knew they could just use expansionary fiscal policy, increase spending, lower taxes, and that would increase demand for labour in the economy. And they knew that's rocket science, not rocket science. But the delicate question became the political one of how to exploit that trade-off to your advantage. Within the left literature, the Marxist literature and progressive sort of institutionalist literature, this concept of the conflict theory of inflation emerged. So why this was more a left type framework was because it was grounded in the concept of class struggle. And so the question, the construction was that workers and capital are at odds with each other, because capital wants workers to work, do the most and pay them the least, and workers want to do the least and get paid the most. That's a conflict that persists today, despite the fact that apparently we're all capitalists these days. And so that class struggle was historically, in this conception, mediated by governments. And you could get inflation occurring out of two different motivations. The first motivation would be if workers became, their bargaining power increased, and so they would push for higher wages, which would then translate through to higher inflation if capital, the price setters, the firms, wanted to protect their margins. Now, if the firms were unable, because of the nature of their product market, the conditions of where they sell into, were not conducive to them pushing their margins, well then they would take the wage hit and take a lower margin, and there would be no inflation. But if they decided that they want to protect their margin, they would push their price up, and then the workers would retaliate because they weren't getting the real wage equivalent that they were targeting, The real wage is the wage, the actual purchasing power of the money we earn each week. And so you'd get an inflationary spiral coming from a wage push. Alternatively, you could get the bosses wanting to increase their margins and screw the workers over. And so they would push up prices. Workers would then, if they resisted the cuts to their real wages, would then retaliate if they were able to, and then you could get a spiral occurring that way. And that concept of inflation was about the struggle over the distribution of income, basically. If workers wanted more and bosses resisted, or if bosses wanted more and workers resisted, you could get an inflation occurring. And that was called, sometimes that was then called cost push inflation. So before we had demand pulling up the prices, this was costs pushing up the prices. Now in reality, you can get costs coming from outside too. So the famous inflation in the 1970s was oil. When oil price went up within 6 months by 400% because of political disputes over the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East. And of course, if you get what happened for those who weren't around or can't remember. And anyone who was around would probably struggle to remember anyway, given what else they were doing, as the joke goes. But, there's a joke about being in the 60s and not knowing. But if there's a raw material shock coming in, the question then for a nation is who bears the real costs of that higher payments to the rest of the world? And and so then that can create struggles between workers and capital about who's going to bear the cost of oil price rises coming in outside the economy to the cost structure of the local economy. Okay, it's very hard to differentiate between those two concepts of inflation. They typically both require the government doing what we call accommodating the distributional struggle, basically. So if there's a wage price push going on and the government battens down policy, what I mean is worries about the inflation, so contracts fiscal policy or pushes up interest rates, then that's not accommodating the inflationary pressures. But for political reasons, and this was particularly the case in the 70s, governments didn't take hard decisions because they knew it would create unemployment. And so the inflation was accommodated and got worse and worse. And it meant that the adjustment later on was more severe. Now, the reason that governments can intervene into one of these distributional struggles, how it works is that if the government's faced with an inflationary spiral, it knows it can stop it in its tracks by tightening fiscal policy. Monetary policy doesn't work very well, but fiscal policy works really well. And so if the government wants to stop an inflation in its tracks, then it just has to tighten fiscal policy, cut spending, increase taxes, or some combination. And how that disciplines the inflation process is it creates soft product markets. In other words, sales drop in the economy and firms can't push prices through anymore, so that stops it, and also creates soft labour markets. Workers start to worry that they might lose their jobs as sales and firms are contracting. So both of those things will cut an inflationary spiral off, but the question then is, what are the manifestations of that? And the orthodox approach is to do, the manifestation is through an unemployment buffer stock. The government can stop an inflation by tightening fiscal policy, but it will create unemployment. And the unemployment disciplines the trade unions. Now, you can discipline them otherwise, and it's going to get really ugly in the next 6 months with trade union policy, I can tell you. But unemployment's a great way, if you just want to threaten the workers, to stop them pushing for wages. Now, what happened in the 70s was that the Phillips curve started to shift. It had been relatively stable for quite a while. Now, the dark ones are 1940. If you can see these dark ones, it's 1948 to 69. And then the blue squares are 70 to 80, that decade of instability. And then the little triangles here as 1981 onwards. And so what happened was that in the late 60s, in that OPEC inflation problems in the early 70s, when the Arabs put up the price, the Phillips curve shifted out. Now, what does that mean? That means, so imagine here, this is the Phillips curve that goes through those from 1948 to 69. This one here, see that? And what happened in the 70s was it shifted out. The observations started shifting out. So these little observations are observations joining unemployment and inflation. And so you got this from all of those dark diamonds, you started to get observations shifting right out there. And what that meant was that for any given unemployment rate, you had much higher inflation. That's what it means. And the curve started to look like that, which was, not a Phillips curve looking thing at all. And then after the 80s, we had two major recessions, and the observations started coming here, and the Phillips curve flattened out. Now, the point of that is only to make a simple point that around the early 70s, monetarism became the dominant paradigm in macroeconomics, and it rejected the trade-off completely. It exploited that statistical instability of the relationship by arguing that there was no trade-off, that governments did not have a choice between inflation and unemployment, that if they wanted to pursue price stability, they had to ensure that the economy hit what was called the natural rate of unemployment, which was a unique unemployment rate determined by the structure of the labour market. I'll tell you more about that in a moment. And that fiscal policy could no longer be used to manipulate unemployment, because all it would cause would be inflation. So what they argued was, and this is about a 2-hour lecture in 2 minutes, but what they argued was that at a particular time, you might have that relationship. And then if the government tried, say you were there and the government didn't want 6% unemployment, they wanted 4% unemployment. So if the government tried to exploit that trade-off by increasing its spending, for example, well then what would happen, they argued, was that people, and inflation would start to rise, and what they argued then, that people would build in that increase in inflation into their expectations of what would happen next, and build that into their wage demands. So not only would you get the higher pressure in the labour market occurring because of the lower unemployment, but you would also get at each unemployment rate a higher inflation expectation, which would manifest into trade unions demanding higher wages because they were expecting prices to go up. And so you would just keep getting these expectations alone pushing out the Phillips curve. And so they argued that what you had to, what the government couldn't defeat that process was the argument. And so the government had to find out what was the natural unemployment rate, where everybody expected the inflation rate to be the actual one, not a higher, and just sit for that. Now, it's really, and that's the NAIRU, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. This NAIRU thing, the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And it was so, therefore it was argued that there is only a unique unemployment rate, that there's no ability of governments to manipulate unemployment without causing inflation. Now, all of that leads us to the comparison between the two buffer stocks. And that monetarist revolution in the early 70s, which was deeply flawed, by the way, but it became dominant and it's what we call the start of the neoliberal period in macroeconomics. And what that meant then, that the central bank would become defined its mission as targeting a stable inflation rate, and whatever unemployment rate emerged as a result of that would be considered the stable rate of unemployment, the natural rate. And in that period, well, prior to that period, unemployment had been a target, a policy target. So governments would, you know, if you're as old as I am, you know that in the federal election in 1961, Robert Menzies I wasn't really cognisant then, but I know it because it was not too far away. Robert Menzies nearly lost government because unemployment went up to 2.1%. There was a credit squeeze on. And the irony, of course, is that he won by one seat majority on Communist Party preferences in a Brisbane seat, which is sort of funny. But that was the era. Unemployment went above 2%. There was absolute crisis, and the governments really strove hard and targeted low unemployment rates. What happened in the 70s and since then is that unemployment became not a target but a tool to control inflation. So if there was an inflationary pressure, the government would create more unemployment, because that was a way of pushing down inflationary expectations. And if you read the sort of central bank literature, which I have the unfortunate practice of reading regularly, you'll see discussions about anchoring inflation expectations. And it's all about keeping those expectations stable. Now, the problem is that the NAIRU approach, the unemployment buffer stock approach, is an incredibly effective way of disciplining inflation. Whether you're a Marxist or whether you're a neoliberal, both of those camps understand that unemployment will stop inflation. The problem, though, is that it's incredibly costly. What I mean by costly, income loss, but also a whole range of personal pathologies emerge. And the other problem is that the buffer stock deteriorates. Now, the concept of buffer stocks comes from agricultural markets. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The problem is that this buffer stock deteriorates. What do we mean by that? What we mean by that is if you study, say, social network theory, you understand that we all have some sort of width or breadth in our social networks. Friends, acquaintances, blah, blah. And what happens when a person becomes unemployed? The social network starts to shrink. And for long-term unemployment, the social network can end up being themselves lying in bed depressed, taking too much alcohol and too much other stuff, and their family's fallen apart and they've got mental health issues. And so they become almost difficult to employ then. Their self-esteem's fractured and so on and so forth. And so to get it's not a symmetric process going out of employment into unemployment, then out of long-term unemployment back into employment. It's a difficult process. And so the buffer stock becomes a less effective way over time of disciplining the inflation processes. And what I mean by that is that long-term unemployed people are considered not to be a particular threat in many cases to the jobs of those who are already working. So there's the idea that bosses can threaten workers with a sack because there's plenty of others out there. Well, if you've got a heap of long-term unemployed who have fractured lives now, they're less of a threat. That's the concept. It's controversial, by the way. It's not necessarily true. And the other question is, well, what do you do as an encore? How do you ever get out of the high unemployment trap? If you've used unemployment to discipline the price level, well, what will happen if you lower unemployment? Well, it just reverses. Not quite, but sort of. These are all the costs of unemployment. I don't think we need to dwell on them. They're horrific. And, you know, my research centre's done estimates over the years, and people just can't believe that the millions of dollars of just the income losses every day to the economy. Massive. So there's all sorts of costs of unemployment, and there's all sorts of advantages of having high levels of employment. All of those things. Income stability, personal risk management, you can look after yourself and your kids. You feel better about yourself, you don't feel socially alienated and left behind. You tend to be able to have a much more dynamic training and skill development profile. You alleviate poverty, you build communities, you have intergenerational stability. And I remember when I was quite young, I heard a seminar from a really old Keynesian economist, and he said, if there's only one thing that full employment delivers, it's that children see their parents going to work each day. And what that means is they learn the idea that you can be part of society and benefiting. It's stuck in my head. Okay, so now we think about MMT. And the idea of how does mass unemployment arise is pretty straightforward. Now, the orthodox mainstream economists, that fortunately you don't have to deal with too often, but I do, they have all these weird ideas about why unemployment occurs. They actually end up, a significant number of them end up, and there's literature, end up arguing that unemployment is an optimal choice between leisure and work. And that depending upon the price that you can get for an hour's labour, we make a decision about how much satisfaction we'll get from earning that 1 hour income, 1 hour labour, and how much we'll get from going for a surf down in Newcastle Beach. And if the surf gives us better pleasure, we'll choose to take the leisure rather than work. And so unemployment is constructed as an optimal choice, depending upon the wage structure, for leisure over work. And so if it's an optimal choice and the unemployed really are just maximising their utility, it's called, well then it can't be a problem, can it? Because we're happily choosing to be at leisure rather than work. It's go figure. But you know, I advise people not to study economics, by the way, because this is what you have to endure for years of your young lives, listening to this bullshit. So a much easier, sensible and statistically robust concept of unemployment is that firms create output if they think they can sell stuff. They won't produce anything if they can't sell it. So firms form expectations of what their market is, what their sales are going to be in a forward-looking period, and then they have to get some raw materials together to make the stuff that they think they can sell, including they have to get labour resources. So the demand for labour is really derived from the demand for products that they expect to have, and their sales, in other words. And unemployment then arises and you've also got a whole heap of people that are out there each day wanting to work. That's the supply of labour, and the demand for labour are all the firms bidding for those workers on the basis of what they think they will be able to sell and how much workers they'll need to produce that stuff. And so it's quite straightforward then. If there's not enough spending to justify the output that's been produced on the expectation of sales, well then firms will stop employing people, and that manifests as unemployment. And so unemployment is a result of a lack of spending relative to what would be required to buy all the stuff that firms want to sell. And it's a system failure. And what I mean by that is that it's a macro failure, and each individual person is really powerless to do anything about it. Because we can go up to a firm and knock on their door and say, well, we'll work for a lower wage. But if the firm can't sell anything, it's not going to hire us no matter what wage we offer. And so we're really, the unemployed are powerless to do anything about it. It's a macro failure which needs a macro solution. In other words, a large policy intervention if the non-government spending is deficient. Now that's what we learnt out of the Great Depression, and that was lost in the Monetarist Revolution of the 70s, which constructed the problem as an individual maximising choice. Now in 1978 I was studying agricultural economics at Melbourne University, just across the road, and one cold June, the lecture theatre was on Royal Parade, it was on the other side there. The topic was the wool price stabilisation scheme. I'm coming back to agriculture now, so I said it before, I just got ahead of myself. And for those who don't know, the wool price stabilisation scheme was a very elaborate price control mechanism run by the federal government. And the federal government did a deal, because the rural lobby was really powerful, they're always powerful. I don't know why, but they are.
The electoral system.
I know why, but I don't agree with why. I do appreciate farming incomes are very erratic because of the nature of harvests, and it's particularly in Australia where we have droughts and things like that. So the federal government agreed with the farmers that they would provide price stability which would allow for then income stability, which I think that's probably reasonable. Now what happened was sheep farmers, wool. So what they did was that if in any one year, let's say that the wool clip was strong, so I'll start off with weak. If for some reason or other the wool clip was weak relative to how much demand there was in the wool markets at the end of the season, well then there would be an excess demand for the wool, which would drive the price up. I should have started the other way. Let's start the other way. If the wool clip is really powerful, really strong, relative to demand, so when the wool sales come up each period, if there's an excess supply of wool into the market, well then that would drive the price down. And what the government, and that would defeat the price stability target of the policy. So what the government did in that case would be to buy the excess wool, take it off the market, and by taking it out of the market, it could stabilise the price. Now, all around our cities, in Richmond and Collingwood here, all around our cities, there were big red brick warehouses built. They're now gentrified apartment blocks. They were the wool stores. That was where the government stored up all their wool that they'd bought to stabilise the price. And then if the clip was bad one year, which is what I started with, and there was an excess demand for wool, which would have pushed the price up above this price target, well then what the government did was get their trucks and deliver the wool back to the market from the wool stores. And that stabilised the price. And so the wool became a buffer stock system, that the government wool stores would increase with wool when the market was strong and would decrease when the market was weak. And the buffer stock would go up and down. And this was these schemes were very popular in agricultural markets. Now, I wasn't so much concerned when I was studying that about wool, but at that time in 1978, for those who remember, unemployment had started to rise and above its full employment period. It was the era of it was when unemployment started to rise and become at elevated levels. And that was my concern. And I thought, well, gosh, this wool price stabilisation scheme is really a full employment of wool policy. If you think about it, it's really a government full employment of wool policy. That the government would buy and sell wool, increase and decrease a buffer stock of wool to regulate the price level in the market. So why couldn't that do that with labour? And that's where the job guarantee came into MMT. Now, Warren had been thinking about this much later, and we didn't know each other then, of course, and he came to the same conclusion from different principles. And so the job guarantee becomes a buffer stock of jobs. So instead of forcing people into unemployment when you're trying to discipline inflation, you force them into the job guarantee. You create a buffer stock of jobs that is always available. It's not a program, it's an ongoing, unconditional and universal job offer to anybody at a fixed price. And it varies then inversely with the economic cycle. So that when the cycle's strong and the non-government sector is strong, they'll bid workers out of the job guarantee because the job guarantee is offering a socially inclusive minimum wage. It's not workfare, it's socially inclusive minimum wage. That means that you can go to the football tonight if you're a job guarantee worker, you can go to Lygon Street and have some dinner, you can go to the theatre if you want. You know, you do the things that are required to be included in society as a citizen. But it has to be at the bottom of the wage structure. It becomes effectively the minimum wage because that allows then non-government employers, when they've got stronger conditions, to bid workers away from the job guarantee pool if they want.
Would that be above poverty, that minimum wage?
Well, I would have thought socially inclusive means it's not poverty level.
But is it achievable? A lot of people are arguing about that on the internet. Is it achievable? It's achievable here, but not in Bangladesh, let's say.
Well, of course it's achievable in Bangladesh.
Oh, okay, right. I'll forget that.
I mean, later, if you ask me about South Africa, I did a work for South African government setting the minimum wage structure within their public works program, and of course it is.
Right. Okay.
Now, this is a really important 2 seconds. My early work was on the Phillips curve and mucking around with ways in which we could defeat that monetarist notion that there was no trade-off. And that's the first few chapters of my PhD. But then it evolved as I got this idea into the idea of an employment buffer stock. But then I realised that in effect, and one step back, the Phillips curve is a central framework within orthodox macroeconomics. However you argue about it, and there's all disputes about measurement and stuff, and dynamics and what have you, and lags and all of that stuff, it's the central organising framework linking the real economy with the nominal economy. And what I mean by that, linking economic activity with price movements. Nominal prices, real is economic activity. It's a central framework, the Phillips curve. And the modern expression of that framework was an unemployment buffer stock system. Now, as I was thinking as a progressive economist, how the hell are we going to get through all of that? We had to come up with our own replacement for that organising framework, the Phillips curve. And the job guarantee as an employment buffer stock replaces the Phillips curve in the macro structure we now call MMT. So if you go out and you're arguing in social media that the job guarantee is peripheral to MMT, well then you don't have a clue. It's a central core component that replaces a central core component of mainstream theory that's done so much damage. And it's not just you can't also conceive of the job guarantee as just an employment creation program. In MMT, it's a macroeconomic stability program. Go back to the first entry on the slide. Full employment and price stability. It's not just a job creation program, it's a specific job creation program that has a buffer stock mechanism and has a fixed wage, and it allows the government to transfer workers from an inflating non-government sector into a fixed price job guarantee sector without causing unemployment. Whereas the current orthodoxy, the NAIRU approach, transfers workers out of an inflating sector into unemployment, into an unemployment buffer stock. In MMT, we think it's better to transfer workers out of an inflating non-government sector into a fully employed job guarantee sector. It's core to our attack and our alternative vision in macroeconomics. It's not something that you can, if you don't like, you can dispense with. It's core.
And as automation, what happens then? When the workforce has that, is that for a spanner in the works?
How?
Because there's no need for these number of workers in the private sector.
Well,
that's if you assume the market determines.
I seem to recall reading in economic history a literature that related to movements in northern England in the 19th century. The Luddites said exactly the same thing. We've had at different points in history, we've had these technological scares and there's no doubt there's job replacement going on, but if you think about it, agriculture sector was 80 or 90% of the economy. It's now what, about 3%? It's been mechanised, automated. Now what have we got? We've got social workers. My belief, and if it was the case that we were going to lose unsustainable number of jobs, well then technology is a choice. And that's what a strong government policy is. We ban plenty of stuff. So if we were really, and I don't believe this is the case, but if we were really worried, we would just invoke our governments to have controls over how much job replacement you can have. But I don't think that's going to be necessary. Okay, let's keep going. I'll go for another. So there's massive macro benefits from not wasting all of that labour. There's also lots of micro benefits. It reduces business hiring costs because it's much harder for a business to hire a worker out of long-term unemployment than it is to someone who's already working. In the late 60s, there was a big debate in America about public employment initiatives because unemployment had risen in the late 60s. And a lot of the progressives said that, look, we could solve this by government employment, which is true. But then there was resistance. Now, who was the resistance from? Existing government employees. Why? Because it was pointed out that a lot of these workers had been unemployed and alienated for so long that they'd actually weren't very savoury. Their hygiene suffered, and they had sort of antisocial tendencies, and so that's no blame of an individual. That's what system does to people who are alienated. And so it's much easier for a person to go in and out of private employment if they're already in employment than it is if they're not. That's a fact. It reinforces intergenerational disadvantage. We know from research that children who grow up in jobless, particularly long-term jobless households, inherit the disadvantages into their adult life. It's a really strong result in psychology and from sociology. That a child who grows up in a household with long-term unemployment tends to have an unstable work history themselves, tends to have higher divorce rates, higher alcohol and substance abuse rates as an adult. So if everyone continues to work, you cut into that intergenerational disadvantage. Really powerful result. Career and training, spatial advantages. I mean, I don't know if you know what's happening in Australia, but our regional areas are hollowing out because of the lack of employment opportunities, particularly for children, young people, not children, young people, and they're all leaving those cities. In Western New South Wales, which had vibrant cities, they're all going into Sydney, and those cities are becoming geriatric wards. Just old people waiting to die. And that's happening all around Australia, it's happening all around the world. And so if you've got a job guarantee, you can it's spatially targeted. It's where people are. Turn up to your local office and we'll create a job for you, wherever you live. And so children, young people may have the option then of staying where they want to stay. And then you can go through all of the other urban literature about congestion and cost structures in big cities relative, blah, blah. In November, we're going to do a road show down the East Coast. We'll end up in Melbourne, where we're going to have MMT and the Green New Deal. And so the jobs that can be done within an MMT framework can all be green. Now, I've got this emphasised. It's not an MMT answer to everything. It's just the most basic capacity that an economy should have. Because it's replacing an unemployment buffer stock system. Ideally, you want to have strong government investment in research and development, in service delivery, in good, well-paid jobs with career development opportunities and all the rest of it. But the fact is that when we have unemployment, the disproportionate costs fall on low-skilled, low-educated people who already have relatively little assets and hope. And so job guarantees is sort of is a minimum that a sophisticated government should do, and then there's all sorts of other things that progressive people should be bidding the governments to do. Did you have a question?
Yeah. How do you
make sure that if you guarantee a job for everyone, that those jobs produce something that's more valuable
Than unemployment?
well, I guess you have a point.
That's your comparison. Even if they produce very little, how do you measure the production?
You have a minimum wage, obviously, and if they produce something that's that you can't cover the costs of the wage, then is that a problem?
No. How are you going to measure the advantages of that? Intergenerational advantage. That's massive. How are you going to measure the spatial advantages of community development in regional areas? Less the increased congestion and infrastructure provision costs in capital cities. How are you going to measure that? And what does it matter anyway? The government sector isn't a corporate sector pursuing profit. It's pursuing well-being and stability. It's for the corporate sector to worry about whether it can make a buck, not the government sector.
So now, what was your next question?
Oh, that was it.
So basically, it's not a panacea to everything. Please, it's not our solution to the world. It's our replacement of the Phillips curve. It's our replacement, which means in less fancy language, it replaces an unemployment buffer stock with an employment buffer stock, which by any evaluation has to be better than forcing people into unemployment. Okay, a couple more points. What's the real cost of it? So people, are worried about the dollars that might be. When we last did the estimates, it was about $6 billion to produce 600,000 jobs. The Australian government spent $8 billion on the Sydney Olympics. But the point is that in MMT we don't think about costs as numbers in budget statements. The costs of a government program are the extra real resources that will be consumed by having the program or not. So hopefully they've got people have a better food or some better life, there will be a few costs there. It's coercive, life's coercive. Yeah, the left criticise me a lot. It's funny. Tell me to read Marx. I think I read it before most of them, but they say, it's just a palliative, it's a band-aid remedy for capitalism. You're just prolonging the destruction of capitalism. That's the sort of hardline Marxist attack on the job guarantee. And what I say is, yes, it is, but I'd much rather today someone who doesn't have a job and be able to look after themselves and their family than in between my almond croissant and my latte in my nice cafe on a Saturday morning be wondering when the revolution's going to come. Administratively impossible, well, it's very opposite because 50 years ago we put a person on the moon and the discussions that have been coming out in the last week, the technical discussions describing their computer systems and the fact that it failed at critical points and the guy was steering it down by eyesight tells me that anything's possible. And we've got very sophisticated industry running the unemployment pool anyway. It's called Centrelink. What jobs? This is this argument, they just make work. Well, we did a survey of 140 odd local governments approximately in 2008 where we asked them how many and what sort of jobs could you offer in your local government area if the federal government paid for them. Sorry about that. Paid for them. And we got estimates of what capital costs would be required, like equipment, and what supervision costs. We came up with hundreds of thousands of jobs that would meet unmet community need and unmet environmental need. And these were really interesting jobs. So the idea that there's not the capacity to produce jobs that will be productive is just a lack of imagination.
2 billion trades.
Yeah, that's there. And think back, and I'm thinking back now to my grandfather, and think how many people have driven from Geelong to Apollo Bay. You know the road, Great Ocean Road? It's a multi-billion-dollar tourist resource for the Australian economy. Do you know when that was built? Great Depression by manual labour. Public Works program, Public Works Employment Guarantee program. And there's beautiful site in America on all of the things that were produced during the Great Depression in the New Deal. All the national parks, the Tennessee water system, all of those incredibly productive infrastructure projects. Huh? Hoover Dam, yeah. Yosemite Park and all that. So when people say to me, it's just make work, well,
Just on that point about the productivity, it seems to me that a lot of jobs these days, you've got departments speaking to other departments, and if all the departments have disappeared, nobody knows. Which is to say that there's a lot of work being done which doesn't really result in anything anyway, but people are busy, and that's the main thing.
Yeah.
So whether the job is productive or not is kind of like a byproduct. The main thing is that you've got people who are occupied. Is that a reasonable statement?
Look, that's a reasonable statement, but it's not my statement. Look, it's even if that was the most you could aspire to within an employment guarantee, that would still be better than that. But you could aspire to much more than that. The old argument that you can get full employment by digging holes and filling them in again. Of course you can. But we've got so many unmet needs. When we've done research on, there's an aged care crisis in Australia, and there's also evidence that people are leaving their homes as old people well before they really have to, before they are totally out of it.
Ready for aged care.
Yeah, ready for aged care. And then you ask the question, well, why are you, why have you going to this bloody aged care place? It's because they can't do their shopping anymore, or they can't do their garden, or they're lonely. Well, there's jobs there. They're not going to ever make a profit, but there's jobs. Reading a book to an old person on a roster system, that's a job. And so when we think about productivity, and then in a minute I'll talk about, we're winding up soon, but I'll talk about sort of the revolutionary concept that I've got about job guarantee. And see, I'd employ musicians and surfers on the job guarantee. And what would I ask the surfers to? Well, what's one fundamental problem in the Australian summer? High drown rate. Why do people drown? Because they don't understand rips and beach. Well, as a surfer, I know exactly how to get out there quicker. You jump in the rip, you know all the rips. And so you'd get surfers on the job guarantee. They could go and surf, but then they'd have to do water safety lessons for school kids on the beach as part of their job. And you have musicians who could play in bands, they make nothing, and then they could be on the job guarantee, and some days they'd have to go to schools and do rehearsals in the school hall, and the kids could come and ask questions about their guitars and all that stuff. Now, what I'm saying there is that if you think about that, then that's a process by which we're redefining what a productive job is. We're redefining it in terms of social benefits rather than producing private profit, which is the way we think of productivity now. And so the job guarantee and I'll come back to that in a moment, because I just want to, it fits in with this. So, and I'll rush through this because I don't want to go on much longer. Basic income guarantee, that's now the progressive answer to poverty an income insecurity. So in other words, everybody's entitled to a basic income. That's the argument, as an entitlement of citizenship. Now, the reason I'm really against income guarantees is because it's surrendering to the neoliberal notion that the government can't create enough work if it wants to. That there's this unemployment, it's a poverty problem, so how are we going to solve it? Well, we'll just give people income. That's surrendering to the neoliberal notion that the government can't intervene and create work. And it's also not recognising that it's also surrendering to the individualistic notion that we're all individuals now rather than we're all contributors to a society. And, you know, I get told by audiences say, I just want to do my art. It's, you know, so why shouldn't I be allowed to do my art? Well, who's going to be producing the food for you and the paints and the easels and that so you can do your art? We're all in it together. That's the old progressive notion of solidarity and collective will. And I just want to do my art arguments are the exemplifying neoliberal individualism. And the other problem of a basic income is that it has no inflation anchor. So if you set the basic income too high, then you're likely to contribute to inflation pressures. And so what buffer stock do you have to use then to control the inflation pressures? Unemployment. And the other point is, as I say here, it's just a further withdrawal of the state from responsibility for well-being. And what I mean by that is that we start to construct people as just consumption units. Okay, here's X number of dollars per month, piss off. Don't demand a job, don't demand to be included in society, just keep eating and at a minimal level and go away. And the problem with that is that we're social beings and we get, and whether you like it or not, we've evolved to a point in time where our social identity, our self-esteem, our network is related to work and our contribution via work. It's not related to sitting around doing our own art yet. And so and this is finishing now. And this is the surfer argument coming back. If we want to evolve our notions of productivity and contribution and social position and all of those things that are really important to us as people, as humans, you know, we've got our friends, we meet our friends in work, we meet our future partners in work, we get self-satisfaction of being part of a team. If we want to evolve so that we can broaden the notions of what a productive contribution is, then it's better to do that under the current sort of cultural institutions within a work paradigm. And a job guarantee can be part of that evolution by offering jobs to surfers and musicians and artists. And so you can still then do your own art, but you've got to bring it back in and contribute and be part of society. Okay, so that's what I think the radical nature of the job guarantee is, and that's why I think that these Marxists that just talk about palliative solutions have really missed the point. That there's a great song by the Brooklyn Funk Essentials, which is a New York funk sort of hip hop band, and it's called "The Revolution Was Postponed because of rain." And it's about these guys about to have a revolution, but everything goes wrong. It's too wet. There's a game on TV they've got to watch, and the revolution next week. And so we, as progressives, we might want to be motivating and active about creating a situation where we overthrow capitalism. Got no problem with that. When we get to that stage, I'll be on the front line if I'm still alive. Probably not. Alive, that is. But in the meantime, we have social crises. We have human needs. And so I'm much more happy to have a palliative with a radical dimension to it, pushing society to new attitudes, than to leave people unemployed. Okay, so I think we'll leave it there. That's it.